Sweet berries. When I was younger, my family and I lived in a rural part of the state that didn't see much of civilization. We lived in a small hamlet of about 93 people and almost 40 square miles. It was nestled in the woods and was sometimes a mystical place during my childhood, and sometimes downright scary. Our community, if you want to call it that, was crisscrossed by a network of unkempt dirt roads that the Count had long forgotten. Potholes and boulders lined the roads, and it was not uncommon for the undergrowth to make passage impossible until someone mowed it down. The story begins on one of these roads late one July afternoon. My brother and I had just finished a triathlon of basketball, tag, and playing in the pool. After drying off, our parents told us to get dressed because we were going blackberry picking. One of the advantages of the scrub along the roads was that a lot of it was blackberry bushes, and as we were on the side of the road and not on a property, we were legally allowed to pick as many as we wanted. My brother and I were happy about this because the blackberries we picked every year were made into jam and cakes or simply eaten after we washed them. Blackberries were our free candy. We dressed in our thorn-proof clothes, cotton long-sleeve shirts and denim jeans. It was already so late in the afternoon that the heat of the day had subsided to a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, so the full-body clothing didn't bother us too much. My brother and I each grabbed a bucket, one of those cheap Walmart Easter buckets, and we all loaded into the van. My dad drove us down the road to our usual Brombeer place, and we all got out of the car. "Don't go too far," Mum said while my brother and I searched for the optimal berry patch. We expected big juicy berries that would inevitably stain our hands, and we'd probably throw them at each other in jest. But what we found was a disappointment. What berries there were dried and shriveled black skins that had been exposed to the heat of the last few days. What the sun hadn't caught was preyed upon by birds. We looked around for a few more minutes and went deeper into the blackberries. Maybe the birds hadn't come here because it was so thorny and the sun hadn't penetrated the dense canopy. But the only berries we found were shriveled and dried up. Discouraged, I started into the forest beyond the brambles, imagining that something was out there waiting for us to cross the thorny threshold into its territory. The berries may have dried up, but we were two plump juicy children ready to be eaten by a beast with countless numbers. I shook the thought out of my head and told myself that it was nonsense and that I was almost 13 and needed to banish such childish thoughts from my mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The forest works wonders and magic, but it also hides things that lurk in the shadows, beyond the sight of humans. After I had successfully scared myself, I nudged my brother and told him that we should go back and tell our parents about our discoveries. He agrees, slightly annoyed that our plan was so unsuccessful. We weaved our way through the brambles, stamping down dead vines and pushing aside the thorny branches that tried to catch us. When I reappeared at the side of the road, I had numerous scratches on my hands. But it was no different to any other year, so I wasn't worried. One year we had tried wearing gardening gloves, but either we crushed the berries or the gloves got caught in the thorns. Either way, we decided to work with our bare hands and put up with the scratches to get at the delicious berries. Mum and Dad were leaning against the wagon with the buckets by their feet, talking. They saw us and asked if we had found anything. Our harvest was reflected in theirs. We all climbed back into the van and decided to drive up and down the road until we found another berry patch. I looked out the window the whole time, imagining the beast I had made up sprinting through the forest, picking up the scent of my thoughts and chasing us. It was voracious and would not stop hunting us until our flesh was in its belly. I shook my head again to throw off the thoughts. Too much Stephen King, I thought. After making a detour and taking a different route, we found a berry field full of almost bursting fruit. My spirit soared when I saw the berries, and my mind was filled with thoughts of the nameless horror of cakes and jam. Childlike excitement flooded my veins and I literally jumped out of the car. My mother uttered the same warning as before and we absent-mindedly agreed as we hurried over the ditch and the blackberries. The berries were huge, at least the size of a coin. Some of them were almost overripe and the juice was oozing out of the cracks in the flesh. They didn't go into the bucket, but were eaten right there. We were young and living in the middle of nowhere, eating unwashed fruit was not a problem for us. The amount of berries we collected was huge. In just 5 minutes I had covered the bottom of my bucket with about a centimeter. I went to another berry bush when a smell stopped me. It was bitter, sweet and yet smelled salty. I called my brother and asked him if he could smell it too. He sniffed the air and made a face. We had trouble classifying it at first, but then we remembered a day at school when the air conditioning had broken down in a classroom and the same smell filled the room. The further we went into the berry field, the stronger the smell became. Although the berries were much bigger here, we decided to turn back and look for another area. We retraced our steps and found ourselves back at the road wheel. We heard our parents romping through the berry bushes and decided to try and catch up with them. They had almost filled an entire bucket and jokingly asked why we were so far behind them. I told them about the sour smell and they told us to stay away from it, but as we still wanted to fill our buckets we joined them in their harvest. The berries in this area were also large but the stench wasn't there. We trudged almost 100 meters from the road into the blackberries before we came across a property marker. We decided not to go any further. My parents suggested instead that we should look up where my brother and I came from, contrary to their previous advice. I spoke to them about it but they waved it off, saying we're adults, we know what we're doing. So my brother and I followed our parents into the thicket of brambles and thorns like dutiful soldiers. Once we were out of the thicket, our parents led us to the place where we had stopped picking. The smell was still lingering in the still summer air. My father sniffed and said it was nothing to worry about. It was just the smell of stagnant water. My mother's eyes grew wide when she saw how big these berries were and was excited about how good they would taste in our pie. The thought of dessert wiped away the doubts in the back of my mind and we started picking. We kept picking until we each had a full bucket. Mom picked a berry and popped it in her mouth, smiling because it was so sweet. My brother and I did the same. A normal blackberry has such a pleasant sweetness, a little hint of bitterness, but these, they were like balls of honey. A single berry seemed sweeter than all the prey we had gathered so far, its nectar flooding my mouth and bringing a smile to my face as my eyes widened at the taste. The smell of the fruit I had bought filled my nose as I reached for another berry, and another. 10 minutes must have passed as we mindlessly feasted on the fruit without thinking about anything else. As he popped the last berry into his mouth, my brother looked up at the darkening sky. The sun was already setting. We had arrived in the field at around 4 p.m., had we really been picking berries for so long? My father said nothing about it and we all sat down in the van with full bellies, good moods and full buckets. We didn't eat dinner that night, instead we put our haul in a colander and washed them in the sink. Then we left them to drain overnight. That night I fell into a deep sleep. I remember it because it was the last restful sleep I would get for a while. The next morning I made my way to the kitchen where our parents packed, chopped and cooked the berries. The packed berries will be frozen and eaten as a snack, the chopped berries will be made into cakes and jam to be sold to our neighbors, and the cooked berries will be boiled down into a syrup to be eaten later for breakfast. I asked them if they needed help, but they said no, so I woke my brother up and persuaded him to take a walk through the forest with me. As we set off between the trees, the sun had just begun to break through the morning clouds. Through the green of the sparse canopy of leaves, the sky glowed a glorious pink as the morning stars faded from view and the moon stood solitary in the earth's crust. The air was fresh, as always in the woods, and still cool. The birds chirped as we made our way through the forest with no real destination in mind for the hike. We each found a good gnarled branch to use as walking sticks and we headed deeper into the forest. The canopy was thicker here and the sky had begun to take on the pale blue of morning as the pink disappeared into the scattered clouds. We came across a stream bubbling through a ditch in the ground and started throwing pebbles into it. I heard the crunching of leaves and was immediately jolted out of my cheerful mood as visions of the nameless beast from the berry field flooded my mind. In my mind I saw it lurking behind us, claws outstretched from bruised hands and shoulders hunched in anticipation of the right moment to attack. I knew it was angry because we had taken its berries. Nothing. A sigh of relief dispelled most of the fears, but not all. At that moment, my brother groaned, long on the floor in fetal position, holding his stomach. I dropped the pebbles in my hand and hopped over to him, startled. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" He pushed me off him and bent down on his hands and knees. He cried out in pain as he held his stomach with one hand and a sudden gush of vomit came out of his mouth. I recoiled in horror as it splashed into the stream. His whole body heaved as he collapsed on his face, vomit spurting out of his mouth and nose and mixing with the dirt. I tried to pick him up but he fought me off and grumbled something incoherent before another loud explosion of vomit gushed out of him. He tried to sit up but the way he clutched his stomach told me he was in too much pain to do so. Instead, I stood there like a helpless fool, watching him press his face into the sludge of vomit as more and more flowed out of him with each violent expulsion, like pus from an infection. Tears streamed down his face and mine as I watched my brother writhe in his own vomit, unable to move in pain. I stood there terrified, not knowing what to do, and then it hit me. At first I thought the urge to throw up was just a result of seeing him throw up, but then I felt the pain. At first it was like uncomfortable flatulence, but then it moved. The gas moved, the pain tugged at my intestines and I felt a hot column of vomit shoot through my esophagus. I wasn't ready and exploded through my closed lips and with a blinding pain from my nose. The wriggling penetrated even deeper into my flesh and soon I was lying on the floor with my brother. The sounds of my own vomiting drowned him out as I closed my eyes and the darkness of my vision turned white with the blinding pain that coursed through me. After a while, I didn't even notice the hot garbage coming out of my throat and time seemed to stand still as whatever was in my guts gnawed at me, forcing itself deeper into me than I had thought possible. The smell finally hit me and eventually caused more vomit to come out of me, muddying the floor I was rolling on. It smelled sweet, like blackberries. As another tart wave pulsed through my throat, the blinding white turned to gray and finally to black. I don't know how much time passed before I was shaken awake. I resisted opening my eyes but a sudden pain made my eyelids pop open as I rolled in the mud and coughed. Nothing came out except phlegm and spit and so it went for the next 3 strokes. Eventually I slowly but surely got my breathing under control and focused on the pain again. It wasn't like before when it moved and twitched but it was localized in the middle of my intestines. It felt like a throbbing mass but it was bearable. My brother was standing over me, his face and side smeared with mud. He leaned on the branch he had been using as a walking stick and nudged me again with his foot. "We have to go home," he croaked weakly, still holding his stomach. I asked him if he was also in throbbing pain and he nodded. I stood up and it felt like every single one of my joints had sandpaper between them. Dried mud stuck to my skin and shirt and we smelled of blackberries and earth, but the throbbing pain and the desire to get home overpowered my will to brush off the dried dirt. I laboriously picked up my own walking stick and we slowly made our way home. Every step was agony. The forest seemed to be an endless plain with an infinite number of trees, through whose leaves and branches whistled the songs of despair of the light summer breeze. No birds chirped and no animals scurried as slithered through the leaf-covered forest floor. Although my brother walked beside me, a feeling of loneliness and doom overcame me and I sensed that death would claim me at any moment. A tremendous sadness pulsed through my veins as the throbbing mass reminded me of my own mortality. At that moment, there was no future for this life and my only purpose was to suffer. As we made our way back to our house, 2 more gushes of vomit found their way through my mouth and onto the ground, my brother collapsing once. "Come on, we need to get home, Mom and Dad will help us," I said as I laboriously bent over to help him up. After what felt like an eternity, we saw our house in the distance through the damn trees and thicket. Our arms were scratched from the branches and thorns we had torn off on our way to the rescue and the throbbing had moved back into my guts. But the sight of the house awakened a hope in me that cannot be described. We stumbled drunkenly up the stairs to our front door and feebly turned the doorknob. The smell that greeted us extinguished any hope that our parents would help us. The smell of sweet blackberries and earth filled my nose and I collapsed on the vomit-soaked carpet. My brother stumbled over me while hot tears of frustration and pain ran down my cheeks. I lay face to face with my mother, whose cheeks were certainly flushed. I remember looking into her bloodshot eyes and thinking that I must look the same. The whites of her eyes were red and her skin, apart from her scarlet cheeks, was pale and clammy. A line of vomit and mucus dripped from her nose as her mouth stood open, her labored breath blowing the stench of vomit into my face and forcing me to spit my own waste from my slack jaw. Her eyes widened as erupted, splattering my face and mingling with my own. It was a vicious cycle until soon we were gasping for breath. My brother, who had seen our wailing, started convulsing himself and I felt his wetness crawling across the carpet and soaking my back. The bitter taste of it all lingered in my mouth, counterbalancing the sickeningly sweet smell. I watched as Mum's bright blue eyes receded in her head and her jaw opened even wider. Her breathing became labored and the fear of my own death was washed away by the fear of my mother's death. I took as much strength as pain would allow and stood up, using the slippery wall for support. My brother curled in the fetal position as I stood over him. I used the wall for support as I searched the stinking house for my father. I found him next to the phone lying on the floor. Around him was the same sweet stench and I knew it must have been the berries that had made us sick, because that was the one thing we all had in common. A sudden pain on your guts and forced me to the floor again where I fell into the vomit-stained carpet. I willed myself onto my side with the floor swelling damp beneath me and reached for the phone. The simple act of walking to this point and reaching for the phone had taken all my energy. As a labored breath passed through my scorched throat, I dialed 911 and put the receiver on speaker. After I gave the emergency call center an explanation and gave them our address, the darkness of unconsciousness dared to take hold of me again. No, 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 I screamed as I felt hot goo running down my side and pooling in my pant leg. The throbbing pain now became a torrent of burning heat that threatened to rip my guts out of me. The spurts and eruptions of hot shit kept coming. Helpless sobs racked my body as I heard the same sounds from my father and the stench of death rose from our guts. I felt it flow out of the seat of my pants and into my shoes as I lay there paralyzed. A new fear began to take hold of me as I felt something wriggling on my leg. No, not just one thing, lots of things. I felt insect legs stinging against my skin, all the things I had freed from my body crawling over my soiled form. It was alive and it had been inside me, the darkness finally catching up with me as another gush erupted from me. When I woke up I saw white. At first I thought death had taken me and you were in the afterlife, but the beeping of my pulse now told me otherwise. I became aware of a needle in my hand and the uncomfortable tilt of my bed. Hospital. I tried to sit up but I was too weak. I turned my head and saw a nurse in a Minnie Mouse gown. I remember those damn gowns so vividly that they are etched in my memory, and I remember the shocked, joyful and relieved look on the nurse's face as she asked for water, and I remember the sadness that settled over her smile as day turned to night. I got my water and went back to sleep wondering why she had been sad. When I came to after what felt like seconds, the same nurse in the same gown told me that it had been more than a week since I had asked for water. More IVs were put into my arms and I felt fine for the most part. I realized you were hiding something from me because her sadness seemed to be lingering under the surface. I asked her why she was sad and she said that I had to wait for the doctor. Over the next 2 days I slowly regained my strength by eating soft and liquid foods and going to the toilet too slowly. The throbbing pain was no longer there, but my bowels were very sensitive. On the 3rd day, the doctor came to see me. He checked my vitals, asked me how I was feeling and then told me to get ready because he had bad news. Somehow I knew what he was going to say and I had hot tears streaming down my face before he announced the news. Mom had succumbed to the berries, her body had lost too much fluid. I cried and told him that none of this should have happened. It was only blackberries, I sobbed snottily into the doctor's lab coat. I cried until all my tears were gone and then I howled until my lungs burned with acid and my throat turned to dust. The doctor held me the whole time, keeping silent and squeezing me gently. I cried myself completely out on his shoulder until I fell asleep. I dreamed that my brother and I were back in the brambles, being stared at by the beast of the forest, its shoulders no longer hunched, its eyes no longer full of hate, its matted hair swaying in the winter as it came towards us. None of us sensed the danger posed by the beast. It stopped a few meters in front of us, just behind the wall of brambles. It opened its mouth, revealing hundreds of gleaming needle-sharp teeth. It spoke, its voice deep and high, like the rumble of thunder mixed with the shrill chirping of summer cicadas. This soil is poisoned, everything that grows here is sour, sick and dead. Eat no more of the bitter earth, the price for your transgressions has been paid. She disappeared into the dark backdrop of the forest and my dreams slowly melted into something I could no longer remember. Over the next week, I regained my strength with an hour of extra therapy a day and started eating solid food. I was told that my brother and father had regained their strength and that they were on their way back to health. At the end of the week my father and brother came into my room along with a man I had never seen before. He introduces himself as a grief counselor. It was the usual "what does he do now" thing, and he gave us a number of resources and hotlines to help with grief and recovery. We hired a cleanup crew to renovate the house and stayed in a hotel about 30 minutes from home for the next 2 weeks. In the evening as I was getting ready for bed my brother noticed a large pimple on the back of my leg. I looked down and saw a red mound the size of a $50 with a sickly white head. I looked at my brother and noticed that he also had one under his sleeve on his upper arm. We went to our father and he said that he had also discovered one on himself. He told us not to lance it because it could lead to an infection. Assuming it would go away on its own, we all went to bed. The next morning I was woken up in the semi-darkness by a burning sensation on my leg, not just on my leg but all over. I threw back the covers and screamed in horror when I saw that my lower legs were covered in large spots, as were my arms, and I could feel sensitive areas under my shirt. Horrified, I started to scream and move towards my brother to tell him, but he screamed in pain and I felt something hot dripping on my hand. My father was woken by the commotion and groaned uncomfortably as he rolled over in his bed to turn on the light and see what was going on. As the light illuminated the room, I saw that my brother was also covered in these bumps and they were throbbing too. I looked at my hand where I could feel the slime and cringed in disgust as I saw a maggot making its way across my thumb. In my daze, I fell to the floor and felt my own pimples burst like bubble wrap. I cried in pain as I got to my knees and felt worms, maggots, or whatever they were crawling out of the pimples on me. One by one they slipped out of the burst infections and tumbled down on me, covered in blood and pus. I heard the clapping on the carpeted floor of the room. "Oh my God," my father screamed as he stumbled out of bed and his own infections banged audibly against the wall. My brother was a little more cautious and painfully pushed himself out of bed. My dad picked me up, the pressure causing more maggots to crawl out of us, and ran out the door with my brother running after us. We went back to the hospital. The emergency room recoiled at the sight of 3 people with maggots dripping out of their skin. The people in the waiting room either ran out in disgust or stared in horror. We were invited in immediately and the same doctor who had me crying on his shoulder saw us again. He stared in medical fascination at the amount of maggots oozing from our combined flesh. We were taken into isolation rooms and given a series of drugs, and after another 2-week stay in hospital the maggot puddles dried up. We had to undergo a small operation to remove every single gastric capsule. Fortunately for us, the maggots are only in the skin and in the superficial muscles. They had avoided our vital organs. The doctors were amazed. They punched us with questions and we all pointed to the berries that had made us so incredibly sick in the beginning. A frozen berry sample was taken at our home, and after a few days in which the berries were analyzed we learned what had made us sick. Ocypus laciniatus lays its eggs in the ripe fruits of the blackberry bushes. The larvae of the beetle are incredibly small and eat the pulp and nectar of the fruit. The beetle chooses only the sweetest berries to lay its eggs in by slitting the berry and putting it in. When we larvae the berries that day, we smuggle hundreds of these larvae into our bodies. We were eaten from the inside out.